Hi, Misha here, and a few people have asked, either on Patreon or in the comments, for me to cover Russia's SVT-40 Tokarev rifle again. And since I have, in at least this year, gone over some of the Mosins, the SKS, yeah, it seems like a good time to talk about this rifle. I still have my two that I've had for a long time. I've got an early 1940s example here, and then a later example from the war. So we'll talk about the changes, of course, what influenced the SVT, and what the SVT influenced, as well as some just fun little facts about what it was, because in a lot of ways this was a very forward-thinking design for Russia. And in other ways, well, yeah. But first, also a little shameless plug. Over on my personal channel, Misha, I've been kind of covering Russian armor. Quite a few tanks, but other vehicles as well. And since many of those I've been covering are World War II related, if you like Russian history, kind of the wacky history that it is, you might check that out if you're bored. I cover from the earliest tanks like the T-18 and T-26 through the crazy T-35, of course the T-34, and some of the other vehicles and rockets and armored guns. And I typically do 1/72 scale die-cast metal models, really just as a prop to talk about the history and mechanics and service. But today on Mishaco here, we're going to talk about and revisit Tokarev's self-loading rifle. Well, in this one's case, Tokarev's select fire rifle. So with that, let's get into it. If when you hear the Tokarev name, you think of this pistol, the Tula Tokarev TT-33, I don't blame you. I think this is his most famous creation, and rightfully so, for what it was and how simple and well it was suited for the World War II period. But the rifle, even though it's not as well known, is just as important. And I will confess that when I was young, and very much still in the beginnings of learning about guns, when I heard of a Tokarev rifle, I was first confused and then very quickly intrigued. And back in the 90s, after the end of the USSR, we did get these in from Russia for a brief time. Before that, we'd had some come in from Finland, where they had been captured during the Winter and Continuation Wars, but the Finnish SVTs are kind of a mixed bag, because the Finns reworked them, especially the gas port. The Russian guns, like this one, were refurbished, much like the Mosins and other guns we see, but they at least are factory original, and they usually are in very good shape. And that's about it, because this was not really, it wasn't manufactured outside of Russia at all, and it was only limited use outside of Russia. So, its designer, Fedor Tokarev, well, he was born in 1871, joined the military as an enlisted man in 1892, and was quickly tasked with being an armorer, instructor, what have you. He was seen to have mechanical knowledge and intuition, and in 1900 he became an officer in the Tsarist Imperial Army. And Russia has always kind of been interested in self-loading or select fire guns, believe it or not. Really, Tokarev's first efforts were in converting the Mosin-Nagant bolt action to this. And then in 1916, well, after technically, but we had the 1916 Fedor V, which was interesting. It was a select fire gun, Nominally, we would probably call it a battle rifle, but the truth is, you could almost call it an assault rifle because Fedorov chambered it to fire the most intermediate cartridge that was readily available. Originally, he wanted to create a whole new cartridge, but World War I didn't allow that, so he used 6.5 millimeter Arisaka. Russia had learned to respect this round during the Russo-Japanese War, and also in World War I, as quite a few Type 30s and Type 38s were given to Russia as aid. So 6.5, while technically a full-power round, is a lot lighter recoiling than Russia's standard 7.62 by 54R. Now, the Fedorov wasn't terribly successful, but they did put it into production. But the vast majority were made under communism, under the Bolsheviks. And in the 1920s, it was decided by State Commission, the bureaucrats, that Russia would focus on the Mosin rifle, the Mosin-Nagant. This is how we ended up with the 9130. However, Stalin came to power between 1925 and 1928, and he was always quite interested in self-loading or select-fire infantry rifles for mass issue. Now, back in America, this is the earliest days where John Garand was starting to work on his design too. And in 1926, and again in 1928, Russia would have a few rounds of trials, and you would have designs from Fedorov, Tokarev, and a new upstart that no one had heard of at this time, Simonov. And no winner was really declared. Into the 1930s, Simonov really worked on his design. It was a wedge locking system with a short recoil piston. And Tokarev, well, he had worked with a recoil operated and then a gas trap system. I know today we kind of laugh at gas traps, but it was a popular concept, especially the Bang version at that time. The idea was we don't want to drill a hole in the barrel for a gas port because this could negatively impact accuracy and reliability if it were to plug up. So let's collect the gas at the muzzle and cycle that way. So they were both playing around. In 1934, Simonov really took the lead with a prototype, which would be adopted as the AVT-36 in 1936. And this was an interesting gun. Had a 15-round magazine, still fired 7.62 by 54R, and it was select fire, single shot and automatic. It was designed to be cheap and easy to mass produce, at least as much as a self-loading gun could be at that day and time. And it was put into production primarily between 1936 and 1938. But it didn't do well. Even before it first saw combat in the Winter War with Finland, it was already basically out of production. Already by 1939, it was canceled. And they built just shy of 66,000. So not an insignificant number for the AVT-36. But backtracking, by 1938, there was another round of trials because the AVT-36 just wasn't shaking out. And it again was pretty much between Tokarev and Simonov. Fedorov was kind of out of the game at this point. But Tokarev's design was more appealing, and Tokarev was success from the pistol and other events, was in Stalin's good graces, friendly with Stalin. Of course, that's a dangerous place to be. But yeah, his design, first known as the SVT-38, was selected in December of 1938 and went into limited production at Tula in the summer of 1939, and then full production at Izhevsk and Tula that autumn, around October. So just in time for the Winter War, so the SVT-38 saw some action there, and again, it did not do well. The SVT-38 was designed to be lightweight as much as possible, and that was kind of its downfall. It had a two-piece stock, and it had a mag that was a little too easy to knock out. At least that was the concept. Therefore, production was halted in April of 1940, and they produced at least 100,000. Some sources say 150,000. I'm telling you, them Soviets, once they cranked those factories up, they really could turn them out in a hurry. But again, the SVT-38 was just wasn't very successful. And at this point, Stalin is losing patience with his former bestie, Tokarev. Meanwhile, Simonov has been working on his design based on the AVS-36. He had the SVS-38 and SVS-40, 41 designs. He's improved it quite a bit. He's dropped the wedge locking bolt system, gone to a tipping bolt system, essentially taken from the Tokarev design. But on the other hand, the Tokarev design kind of borrowed the short stroke gas piston from Simonov. So there's a lot of back and forth because these guys aren't doing it for money. They get their name on the gun. That's about it. Otherwise, they're kind of earning a state pension. But hey, at least they do get their name on it. So after the Winter War, yeah, things are a little rocky. And essentially, the SVT-40 here is Tokarev's last chance. Even though the AVS-36 and even the SVT-38 had issues, I really want to point out that both predated the final version of the M1 Garand. In fact, the M1 Garand wasn't officially adopted until 1936, and for the first 5 years, it was a gas trap system. So these guns were really ahead of what was going on in America. And at this time, Germany had essentially nothing. Britain had nothing. If anything, probably the next best country for a self-loading or select fire rifle might have been France. But anyway, the SVT-38 and SVT-40 are essentially the same inside. Same gas piston system, same tilting bolt. The SVT-40's receiver is a smidgen shorter. It has a single-piece stock, more durable. It has finger grooves in the stock. We've gone down to one barrel band. We've also gone to kind of a shorter forearm, and we have an extension. We have a shorter muzzle device. We've moved the cleaning rod from the side to under the barrel. We have the standard 10-round mag. Now, because SVT-38s had issues with the mag coming out, they actually made the catch folding for the mag. It's actually kind of a rock and lock style mag. This mag actually kind of reminds me of an early AK mag, just larger, of course. We have a manual safety here, just simply blocks the trigger. And scope rails are standard on all SVT-38s and the original SVT-40 design, because the idea, yeah, it had iron sights, but they hoped that some of these could be used as, if not sniper guns, at least DMRs. In fact, the idea was to have fully 1/3 of a division's guns being SVT-38/40s by 1941, and to be producing 2 million a year no later than 1942. Flipping this over, you can see that it has a reciprocating charging handle. I'll set you down here. Actually, it's a very nice, easy throw. And actually, somewhat unique for the day and time, our detaching mag, when you put it in, the catch can fold up, and with the bolt back, it has a hold open. It actually holds itself upright too, which is really neat. It's not meant to, it's just what it does. It can be topped off by stripper clips, 5-rounders using the Mosin. They did also manufacture 3 magazines for every gun, so typically a soldier would carry the 1 in the gun plus 2 in a leather pouch. And when you do remove the mag, the bolt does stay open. So it's not just a crude device. It actually has a true last round hold open. Pretty neat, honestly, for that day and time. So we have this kind of metal handguard up here. We have an adjustable gas system. And the cleaning rod, because I had some trouble with these falling out in the SVT-38, it's actually held on with a spring-loaded clip up here. And the muzzle device is actually a single-piece unit, not unlike on an M14, at least in concept. And this was done to try to keep good accuracy. And the original style is this fishgill type ported brake. The SVT-40 was still designed to be as lightweight as possible, and they shortened it up just a little bit. But they did make it a stronger design, reinforcing a few things like the stock, some internal components, and they did some things to streamline it for full mass production. And this is kind of the Soviet way of doing things, be it guns, aircraft, or tanks. They'll go ahead and put the first version into mass production and then let events in the field, feedback from soldiers, dictate the next variant. This is why you usually see relatively small numbers for the first production models of any Soviet hardware. They kind of let the bugs get worked out in the field and then go back and revise them. This is why you also have the TT-30 and then the TT-33. Of course, you have the AK-46, AK-47, AK Type 1, 2, 3. This is just how they did things. And it actually makes quite a bit of sense. So the original SVT-40 would go into production in July of 1940. It would first be at Tula, and later production would be set up at Izhevsk and Podolsk. And that year, they would only crank out about 70,000, give or take. And so by 1941, June 22, a day which certainly lives in infamy in Russia, they did not have near enough of these to equip every third man in the Red Army, at least in the infantry, but they did have quite a large number. Plus, they would produce up to 1 million in 1941, before and after Operation Barbarossa. Of course, they would lose a large number during that war as well. But production would continue despite everything. With the Tokarev TT-33, even though this is actually a post-war pistol, pre-1941, pre-Barbarossa pistols were made with a reasonably high degree of fit and finish, decently polished, perfectly acceptable bluing, synthetic logo grips. And in 1942-43, they greatly simplified the production, going to slab-side wood grips, a very thin, almost grayish, washed-out blued finish, rough machining. And of course, you can see this with Mosin-Nagant PPSH 41s, really any Russian hardware, even T-34 tanks, probably especially T-34 tanks, frankly, because of the situation in Russia. And the SVT-40 was no different. There were many changes implemented very soon after its production, and so let's talk about a few of those. One reason I usually own two of a gun, if and when it's possible economically and just, life, is I really like comparing production changes. That's why I have a relatively late production one here and a relatively early production one here. Now, one of the first changes made actually occurred really before or right around the time of Barbarossa. Originally, the upper metal shroud here had 8 holes. This was reduced to 7 in 1941, and actually it was made a little bit taller. If you notice, this is a smooth top here, and we'll look closer at the top in a minute. and this one actually has a step up. So that was kind of an interesting little thing that happened very early on. Now, as I said, these all had scope rails, but not all of them were DMRs. In fact, only a handful coming out of the factory were. It had the extra cut in the rail, as you can look online, and they did issue these with PU scopes and quickly discovered that because of vertical stringing, poor stock fitment, and just heating up of the systems and just the overall harmonics, this was a really not great DMR. So actually production of the SVT-40 PU version was discontinued by 1942, and they only turned out, well, fewer than 52,000. So if you see what is purported to be an original sniper, do your due diligence, let's just say that. So yeah, after Operation Barbarossa, Irshevsk was ordered to switch from the SVT-40 to just full-bore Mosin-Nagant 30 production. So they would run out the year, and that would be it at Irshevsk for this. Podolsk would continue to build these until the factory had to be evacuated. And while there were some efforts to take the tooling from Podolsk and start over, it didn't happen, so they're out. And there are old rumors of the Tokarev factory producing these. They're not true. It's just mistaking symbols and just mistakes in general. Tula, of course, was also evacuated, but they would begin production in 1942. Now, as I said, in 1941, they would build about 1 million. In 1942, Tula, the sole manufacturer of the Tokarev rifle, would build about 265,000 and would continue to do so. But of course, because of the resources and everything, we would have several changes to simplify the production. And that's kind of what we want to talk about here. One of the most noticeable is the muzzle device. We go from the ported fishgill type to the much larger, more conventional brake with just the 4 ports. This happened relatively late in 1941, and this brake, the 4-port, is actually quieter, which is good for the guys around you, but it's less effective by about 40% than this style. But more importantly, it's much faster to machine. So, you know, that's pretty critical. We had general simplifications of parts, including the receiver. They deleted the scope rails, actually quite early on, September, October of 1941, because again, yeah, unless they were going to make it a dedicated sniper gun, which there was not looking likely, it just wasn't worth it. Another change, they went from a original trigger guard here that's kind of machined out on the sides to save weight, a little bit of a step, to just more of a slab side one that has a little bit more cut behind here. So the trigger guard was simplified quite a bit, as were the magazines. In no great noteworthy way, just yeah, less fit and finish put to the mags, what have you. Looking at the underside, we can see the trigger guard here. Now they did originally drill holes in both the catch and the safety, and they would remove these in later production. Unfortunately, both of mine have the holes. Again, small parts get replaced, and also old parts simply get used up. These don't have, this should probably have the hole. This is correct, this probably shouldn't, but yeah, c'est la vie. Bottom of the mag. You can definitely tell this one's a little cruder. The bands stay pretty much the same. As do the bayonet lugs, and the cleaning rods. They keep the spring-loaded catch here. Now looking at the top, we can look at the rear sight. It has a lightning cut down the middle. That was removed to save time. Pretty obvious. It's also worth pointing out, originally the bolts were in the white, although when they were refurbished like this one, they were often given a plum or brown hue. But in 1942, when Tula was setting back up at its new place, they switched to simplified blued finish for the bolt carriers, really. I say bolts, but it's really the bolt carrier. So they simplified the finish. And of course, they simplified the bluing wherever they could, as well as just the machining becomes coarser. And looking here, we can see the smooth top of the early cover, and then how this one humps up. I would imagine that was actually probably done for reliability, for impacting the gas piston, but I could be wrong. We still retain the adjustable gas system and front sight. Of course, we had to keep the hole in the top of the front side so it could be adjusted. And finally, flipping these over to the left side, you can see no scope rail here either. Here. And we can look at one other change made in late 41, early 42. Went from a two-piece sling swivel to a single band style, single piece type. Again, easier to machine, one piece versus two. Makes perfect sense. So by 1942, we kind of have the final version. In 43, they would make a few other changes, for example, to the lower shroud to simplify its production. And then in either 43 or 44, they would actually go away from the swivel to a Mosin-style slot in the stock. Although very few guns actually left the factory with those on them, with stocks like that. Most, if they had them, they received it during the refurbishment after the war. But feature-wise, aside from the scope rail going away, and maybe a slightly less effective, although quieter muzzle brake, there are all these changes to simplify and speed up mass production. Now, like I said, the sniper version was taken out of production, but in May of 1942, this version was put in. Notice the safety flips here on this and stops. On this one, that's safe, and then there's a third position on the other side for select fire. In May, they introduced the AVT-40, a select fire version. Now, they were under no delusions. They knew this was not going to be a great gun, but they had such a shortage of machine guns that they hoped this could maybe fill that role, since it wasn't working out so great as a sniper gun or a DMR. Unfortunately, the AVT-40 didn't work well. And even if it did, it only had a 10-round mag. So an order came down from on high, only use these in semi-automatic mode unless directly ordered by your commanding officer. And they did make another change for the AVT-40. They went to a thicker buttstock, especially around the wrist area here, but overall just a beefier stock. The original SVT-40 stock, even though it was a single piece versus the two from the SVT-38, it was still designed for lightweight, and these were known for cracking, especially with hard use in the field. So they hoped that the we'll call it the AVT-40 stock, although it's really not. These are put on all later guns. Might fix that and let it hold up a little better to the automatic fire of this gun, but it didn't. It was better in a semi-automatic gun, but in full auto, this gun broke itself apart because it wasn't the most durable gun by Soviet standards. Now, by other standards, yeah, it was pretty darn durable, but the Russians have a certain other requirement of their weaponry as far as durability. But in 1942, Tula was making these, but IHS was cranking out M90 130 Mosins, And we have a newcomer on the scene, the PPSH-41 submachine gun, which kind of took everyone by storm and really did a good job, better than expected, both in the battlefield and on the production line. And they could make so many more Mosins and PPSH-41s for every one SVT that its days were already numbered. These kind of were given to elite special forces, like the Marines, sometimes just kind of the most accurate guy in the company if they wanted to try to use it as a DMR. And a lot of times NCOs would kind of pick these up as a little bit of a status symbol. And it is a relatively light and compact gun. It's only 8.5 pounds, which maybe sounds heavy by today's standards, but by the standards of the 1940s, really wasn't bad at all. Now it is 48 inches long, with about a 24.5-inch barrel, but, you know, it's kind of just that day and time. It was decided to be a full rifle shooting across the steppes of Russia. So production would continue in 1943 and 1944 at the relocated Tula, but it was officially discontinued in January of 1945, really with them just using up their leftover parts. In the first 2 years, well, 3 technically, they produced about 1.3 million of these. Total production was only 1.6 million, so even though they were hoping to do 2 million per year, total production was less than that over nearly a 5-year run. That means in 1943, 44, 45, they just built around 300, at most 350,000 of these. So relatively low numbers by anyone's standards, but especially by Soviet standards. The gun, well, it was old world technology, and its issues really had to do a lot with its caliber more than anything else. And while Tokarev, the man, tried to make designs later on, this was really his last chance. But luckily for him, he was not in fact shot or even sent to the Gulag. So Stalin really must have liked him. No, but his old competitor, the younger and more with it, Simonov, would take over with his SKS 45, adopted not long after the SVT-40 was taken out of production. But even it, of course, would be eclipsed by a little-known tank man's gun, Major Kalashnikov. So it didn't meet with great success in Russia. But the Germans, they felt very differently about Tokarev's rifle. Now, the idea of a self-loading, mass-production, standard-issue infantry rifle in Germany had been floated around by some for a very long time, even as late as, or as far back as World War I. But it didn't gain a lot of traction. As the Nazis rearmed and reorganized in the 1930s, they really emphasized the machine gun supported by the infantry, and for that they felt like bolt-action Mausers were plenty good. And for what they couldn't do, hey, they have MP-38s and MP-40 submachine guns. Good enough. But even though the Russians weren't as impressed with the SVT-40, especially its production numbers, the Germans, when they encountered it during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, they learned to respect it. And that really let them spearhead their own Gewehr 41 program, which had been going on for a little while. We had the 41M from Mauser prototype, and we had the 41W from Walther. But it was because of the SVT's performance in Barbarossa that really got them to push forward, eventually adopting the Walther that year and putting it into mass production. But the Gewehr 41, the G41, was pretty meh. It used that old gas trap system, that bang system. This added a lot of weight towards the muzzle. This is even though it's about as long as the Tokarev, it's quite a bit heavier gun. And the bang system, it clogged up very easily, had to be cleaned. Luckily, you could get to it quite easily. It just wasn't terribly reliable. And then they had the flapper style bolt system back here. And they had a fixed 10-round mag. These were intended to be fed exclusively by stripper clips. But they captured and reissued enough SVT-40s. They knew a good idea when they saw it. It's oft claimed that Russia kind of ripped off the MP-44, creating the AK-47. To which I say, if so, well, Germany did it first. They copied a couple of elements from the Tokarev for their Gewehr 43, later K-43. For one, the detaching 10-round magazine, at least the whole concept. And of course, it's a different mag because it's 8mm. And for another, the Tokarev's short stroke gas piston system. They thought that was a much better idea than the bang or gas trap system. And they were right. And when you take apart a G43, you can definitely see it. So here's our short stroke gas piston. On the German gun, it does have a little more complexity because of course it does German, but it's the same basic concept. Hole in barrel, puts gas on spring-loaded piston, which comes back and thwacks the bolt carrier. It is not connected to the carrier, returns home with the spring, and repeat. And for both, you just remove the front band. On the Gewehr 43, it's very easy. Just use a tool like a bullet tip to slide the band forward and your handguard comes off. On the SVT-40, it's pretty much the same concept, although you do need to remember to remove the cleaning rod first. Once you do it, you can press the button on the band, slide it forward, and actually the handguard comes off in two sections, the metal and the wood. And yeah, so that they definitely directly copied that and the whole concept of a detaching mag, because, I mean, why wouldn't they? It's a good idea. Grand. Germans captured a good number of SVT-38s, designating them as the Gewehr 258R, and SVT-40s, designating those as the Gewehr 259R. And as is famously known, they had so many and they reissued them so many times, they actually printed a German language manual on how to operate the SVT-40. In Russia, a lot of the conscripts complained the SVT-40 required too much maintenance, cleaning, but that had a lot more to do with the operators than the gun itself. The Germans, especially in 1941, which were mostly a professional army, they hadn't yet got to the point where they were taking raw recruits off the streets. They maintain these guns, and if you do that, especially considering these fired corrosive ammo, yeah, I mean it's pretty darn reliable, and you know, if you take care of it. But the main drawback, Russia just wasn't in a situation to mass produce a self-loading rifle while being invaded by totalitarian hordes. But I did want to compare the two. I've done several videos on the Gewehr 43. We can do another one if you want, but you can check out some of the older ones. But it is something worth pointing out that they definitely, and this is a later K-43 with the revised gas system. The original 43s made in 1943 were even closer to the Russian gun. So Nazi Germany definitely reissued the Tokarev rifle. Russia would keep it in its inventory officially until 1955 when it was finally declared obsolete, but in reality they were taken out of the field, refurbished, and put into storage for kind of a doomsday scenario, which never came, thankfully. Finland captured quite a few SVT-38s during the Winter War, around 4,000, and then another 15,000 SVT-38s and SVT-40s during the Continuation War, 1941 to 1944, meaning they had roughly 19,000. And they would refurbish and reissue theirs, much as they had done for Mosin-Nagants. But a Finnish gun, oftentimes people think of Finnish guns as not having been refurbished. Truth is, they have been, just not Russian style. The parts are often not matching or force matched. But more importantly, for reliability, especially in Finland's winters, they would actually just drill the hell out of the gas port, making it very open, venting a lot of gas into the system. And this caused problems with the Gewehr 43. This is why you're not supposed to shoot a Gewehr 43 today without an AP filter kit, because it could crack the receiver because of overgassing. Now, in the German case, they knew what they were doing. They were losing a war. But in Finland's case, they just did it. So if you do get one of the Finnish imports, just know that it's probably going to be overgassed. And of the ones that Finland had, they kept them around for a little while, finally selling about 7,500 to the Inner Arms Company, which were sold on the American market, at least the majority of them, back in the 1960s and what have you. This is actually pretty much our only good source for SVT-38s, even if they have received Finnish rework. So yeah, Germany and Finland were kind of the most noteworthy users outside of the Soviet Union. We did see some given to China and North Korea, but were of limited use there. And they really didn't get distributed to the Combloc countries, the Warsaw Pact, except for this one here, which came out of Bulgaria. At least that's the best theory. Bulgaria does seem to have acquired some after the war as well. And that's where these came into the country. Whereas you can get some of the Inner Arms imports, and you can get some of the Russian Federation imports from 92 to 94 that were refurbished. These are the Bulgarian light refurbs that are pretty much in original condition, although might have been gone over a wee bit. By the way, here's the kind of SVT multi-tool. Namely, it's for adjusting the gas system up here. I mostly just keep it stuck in my sling. As far as slings, anything, in World War II they put whatever sling they could. Usually you'll see Mosin slings or PPSH-41 slings. Sometimes you'll see a couple of actual dedicated leather slings on a Tokarev rifle. But in the war, just whatever they had. But service really did not extend past the 1950s, no matter where it was. And that was pretty much it, guys. In a lot of ways, when introduced, this was the best mass production self-loading infantry rifle in the world. If you think about it, the M1 Garand was still a gas trap system. Even if you excuse that, this has a detaching box magazine and was issued with typically 3 mags per gun, whereas the Garand used the en-bloc clip system. The Gewehr 41, which was later than it anyway, didn't really play a factor. Even the Gewehr 43, I would argue, is not any better, that's for sure. And, well, France, they had their own issues. Yeah, this really was one of the best guns of its day and time. Unfortunately, it would have been a really good gun for someone not the Soviet Union. For the Soviet Union, the Mosin-Nagant and the PPSH-41 really were the best solutions. And then in 1943, they discovered the joys of intermediate cartridges, and that allowed Semenov to come again with his revised design. And really, the SKS does trace its lineage right back to the AVS-36. So, yeah. And the whole system is very similar. Tilting tipping breech bolt, short stroke piston, just shorter, firing a lighter cartridge. Kind of interesting. But of course, even it would be left in the dust by modern guns derived from the Kalashnikov. So there we have it, folks. Another review, recoverage of the Tokarev rifle. It's a really cool gun, and they're actually very nice to shoot. The muzzle brake is shockingly effective for 1940s technology, and they are quite reliable. And in a way, the idea of a DMR for mass issue firing 7.62 x 54R wasn't wrong. It lives on in the SVT-40 and the PSL, which proved that the overall concept wasn't bad. It's just they weren't up to making these to a standard that would provide for the right level of accuracy. So let me know what you think. If you own one of these, I'd love to hear what variation and style you have, because there are some neat differences. And if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.